Hi, this is Mike from Mike's Unboxing Reviews and How To, and on today's video, a slightly different unboxing, but an overview as well, of the ASROCK B550 Pro 4 motherboard. This is an AM4 motherboard, and it's currently available actually on AliExpress extremely cheap. So if you're looking for a potential upgrade for your B450 motherboard, or you're just trying to put together a budget-minded B550 system, this is potentially a fantastic value for money proposition. Now, I actually picked this up from AliExpress for just under £60 plus taxes, so all in around about £65, delivered and shipped to the UK. This is actually what they call a refurbished board, and the company that sells them does appear to have multiple units in stock, so potentially by the time you watch this video they should still be in stock. I will of course, as always, put links in the video description for the AliExpress version, and also if you feel like picking one of these up from somewhere else, such as Amazon or Overclockers or any of those types of places, there should be links in the video description with localized pricing. Now, being that this was a refurbished model, we don't get all of the accessories and we don't even get a retail package, just a plain cardboard box, but we do also receive a couple of SATA cables and also an I/O shield. Other than that, the motherboard comes as it is. It does have all of the heat sinks attached, and it does appear to have all of the M.2 screws attached also. So if you are purchasing from AliExpress, hopefully you should receive one exactly the same as this. So let's go ahead and take a closer look at the board and see what it potentially can offer you. So looking at the board itself, actually I think this is quite a nice aesthetic. The Pro 4 range from ASROCK has always been one of my favourites. The B450 Pro 4 is still being used in Kath's PC and has been in service for probably about 6 years by now. So these are pretty much workhorse motherboards, often used by OEMs, and that is something to watch out for. If you have got one of these already and you struggle to update the BIOS, sometimes they actually have custom-made BIOSes from places like CyberPower and iBuyPower, those types of things. So if you have got one of these and you're struggling to update it, don't worry, we are going to have a separate standalone video on how to update the BIOS on these boards. So in terms of heat sinks and the board itself, so we've got a nice big heat sink here over the VRM. The VRM is a 6+2 setup with 50 amp chokes. You've also got an M.2 shield here with reasonably nice sized heatsink on there for PCI Express Gen 4 devices. The bottom slot, unfortunately, there's no cover on there, but quite often you can pick up those very cheaply, and in fact I'll try and link some videos to those, obviously not the Arctic one. Another nice feature this board has, which sometimes can keep costs a little bit lower, is the fact that there is optional Wi-Fi on this. So you can get this as the Pro 4 and also the Pro 4 Wi-Fi. This particular version doesn't have the M.2 Wi-Fi key installed, but you can add one of those very easily for somewhere in the region of about £15, and that will add in Wi-Fi 6, potentially Wi-Fi 6E. And also we will be doing a separate standalone video on how to do that should you wish to. So let's do a tour of the board and I'll give you some of my thoughts. So at the top here, so we've got a 8-pin and also a 4-pin EPS power connection. So you can choose to use either just the 4-pin if you're using a really low-end APU, or you can use the 8-pin or the 8+4 if there's potential for overclocking. Now I would say do temper your expectations. The VRM on this is relatively weak at only 6 phases, and they are using a doubler as well, so there isn't going to be a lot of headroom for overclocking. And also Hardware Unboxed have actually tested this back when it came out against the 3950X, and the VRM did get a little bit toasty. It did pass the test, so you're not going to have too many problems there. But if you're considering buying the latest and greatest processors, maybe a 5900X or one of the X3D variants, and you're planning on doing some form of overclocking, just do bear that in mind that the VRM on this is slightly weaker than some of the other B450 boards on the market. Also nestled in where the power connectors are, there is actually a CPU fan header. So you've got two at the top here. So you've got one which is there, one which is there. So if you're using some kind of water cooling, you can use these headers as water pump connections, or for your radiators. The choice is entirely down to you. All of the PWM headers on the board are, well, PWM, and also will support DC control, and also can be really easily modified in the BIOS should you need to. The ones that are marked up water pump also have up to 2 amp power limits on them. Just underneath that, we've got our AM4 socket. So this actually is one of the boards which will support an awful lot of processors. Again, I'll put some links in the video description so you can check out what CPUs are supported. But this is one of the few boards on the B450 range which actually fully supports things like the 3200G and also some of the older 200 series. So potentially that might be beneficial if you're building a system and you've got an old processor knocking around. Moving across, we've got our RAM slots. So this is going to support up to 128 gigabytes of RAM. Really, with this for a B550 motherboard, I would probably recommend 3200 or 3600 as being the kind of recommended norms for those types of processors. But if you're using an APU, this can support up to 4733 megahertz, although your mileage may vary. At the top here, we've got two of our 4 RGB connections. So you've got a 12 volt RGB 4-pin, and also there's a 3-pin 5 volt addressable RGB. Those are also replicated down at the bottom, which we'll take a look at shortly. Moving down, main 24-pin power connector. Underneath that, USB 3 Type A front panel header connector. Moving down from that, we've got 6 SATA ports. Now, something to bear in mind, as is the limitation with a lot of B550 motherboards, if you're using all 6 of these, then you will have limited access to the M.2 slot at the bottom, as these are both coming from the chipset. So SATA ports 5 and 6, if you're using those, that will be disabled. Obviously, if you do want to use an M.2 drive, just make do with SATA ports 1, 2, 3 or 4. Just across from there, we've got the B550 chipset with a nice sized ASROCK heatsink. No fans required to keep this cool. And underneath the SATA ports, there's something which is really handy, and yeah, I really do like having this on a motherboard. That is your diagnostic D-LEDs. So they light up, there's 4 LEDs on there. You've got CPU, RAM, VGA and boot. So if there's a problem with your CPU or the BIOS is not supporting your CPU, which is installed, the CPU LED will light up. If your RAM is incompatible or not configured correctly, you'll get the RAM LED illuminate, VGA if there's no graphics card installed or you've got it plugged into the wrong port. And the boot one normally comes on to say that you're actually in the BIOS screen. So if you've got the boot LED on, but you can't see anything on your screen, there's a chance that you've got your monitor plugged in wrong or it's not fully inserted. Next, we'll take a trip across to the other side of the board. So let's look at the PCI Express and also the M.2 connectivity. So we'll start off with PCI Express slots. So at the top here, we've got a armored PCI Express Gen 4 x16 size slot, fully wired for x16. Underneath, PCI Express Gen 3 x1. Then you've got a full-sized PCI Express Gen 3 x16 slot, but is only wired for x4. And at the very bottom there, there's another PCI Express Gen 3 x1 socket. When it comes to the M.2s, there's technically 3, but one of them is not for drives. It is only for Wi-Fi cards. So this top slot, PCI Express Gen 4 x4 with the heatsink attached. Underneath that, we've got our M.2 Wi-Fi for Wi-Fi cards only. And at the bottom there, PCI Express Gen 3 x4. This one comes from the chipset and again, doesn't have an included heatsink. Next, let's take a look at our front panel connectivity along this bottom section. So first of all, we've got our normal front panel connections. So hard drive LED, power switch and reset switch. Next to that, you've got your optional ones for PC speaker and also for the 3-pin LEDs. Next to that, there is a PWM fan port. Also, you've got easy access to the clear CMOS switch. Just bridge that to clear your CMOS settings. Next to that, 2 USB 2.0 front panel connectors. Then you've got another 2 PWM fan headers. Next to that, we've got the last of our RGB ports. So there is a 3-pin 5 volt addressable RGB and also a 12 volt 4-pin RGB. Next to that, a TPM connector if you want to use a separate TPM device. Then you've got a COM port header if you wish to use that. And finally at the end there, we've got our HD audio front panel connection. And also we've got our audio chipset and capacitors. This is actually using the Realtek ALC 1220 or ALC 1200, depending which one's installed on your particular board. Very good chipset, very nice, supports up to 7.1 surround sound and is slightly elevated against some of those other Realtek chipsets. Also, you may have noticed the CMOS battery is actually missing. Now this is something to bear in mind if you're buying this from overseas, generally because of batteries and shipping, etc. limitations, they might not have one. So make sure you've got a CR2032 battery handy if you need one. Moving up slightly from there, which is a little bit hidden away, there is another fan header port just here above the PCI Express slot. So this is going to be ideal for connecting up rear fans. That giving you a total of 6 PWM headers on this motherboard, which I think is a really good number. Something else to think about before we take a look at the rear I/O is also the BIOS setup. So ASROCK generally are really good with this. There is actually a little sticker on the BIOS chip there saying P2.10. So that is the BIOS revision that is actually installed on the motherboard from the factory. Now obviously if you're buying a brand new board, that is going to be what it is. If you're buying a used board, then potentially it might have been updated already. Which leads me on to the rear I/O and the lack of a BIOS flashback button. This particular board is one of the few B550 motherboards that doesn't have a BIOS flashback button. Now this isn't going to be the end of the world. You can use older processors to flash the BIOS, but if you're buying this and you are concerned that you don't have access to an older CPU, then do bear in mind that based on the production time of the motherboard, you may struggle and may need an older CPU to be able to update your BIOS. So let's take a look at the rear I/O. So we've got a reasonable amount of USB ports, 6 in total. You've also got a keyboard or mouse port there on all PS2 ones, should you wish to use it. The USBs there, USB 3.0, those are going to be 5 gigabit per second. You've also got a VGA output, so if you're putting an APU onto this, you can use the integrated graphics. If you're not using a G series processor, it won't have onboard graphics, so the VGA port and also the HDMI port won't function. Next up, there is an empty bracket there, so if you get the Wi-Fi version of this, this will have your Wi-Fi antenna connections there. We'll be showing you how to do that in a separate video. Moving along, we've got our fastest ports. So these are USB 3.2 Gen 2. So these are 10 gigabit per second ports. You've got a Type A and also a Type C. Next up, we've got some slightly older USB 3.0s. So those are 5 gigabit per second, another 2 Type A's. And also we have the integrated Realtek Ethernet, which sadly is only 1 gigabit, which is going to be fine for most people, but I think it would have been nice to have 2.5 gigabit. And finally, we've got our audio connectivity, color-coded, so green for speakers or headphones, you've got pink for microphone, and blue for your line in. Now, of course, if you want to use some sort of analog 7.1 or 5.1 surround, you will have to tie in the front panel connectors, which is a pretty ugly thing. Realistically, I would probably go for a USB DAC if that is your choice. On the back of the board, there isn't a great deal to speak of, but I will mention something. There are some actual illuminations on the side there. So there are 6 LEDs there, which will display your RGB. Now, of course, if you want to turn those off, you can turn those off in the BIOS and disable them entirely. But if you're looking for a little bit of ambient light show, that is where the LEDs are. So there you go, that is it for a tour of the ASROCK B550 Pro 4. I really like this board, and it's one of the few boards that I've never got around to actually owning for very good reason. Generally, the pricing of this on the normal market for the brand new boards is somewhere in the region of about 90 to maybe 130 pounds, depending when and where you're shopping, which then puts into really close competition with things like the MSI B550 Pro Gaming and other models which potentially might be discounted, of which those do offer very similar features and a better VRM, and of course also the USB flashback button for updating the BIOS, which I do actually depend on quite a lot. Other than that though, if you can pick this board up nice and cheaply, like I did from AliExpress for £65, including customs and shipping, I think this is a cracking value for money and is basically the same sort of price as you can pick up for, if you're lucky to get an A520 board, which in general I would probably avoid. They are very limited and they've only got PCI Express Gen 3, whereas this has a full complement of PCI Express Gen 4 for both the top slot for M.2 and also for your graphics card. So if you're using a slightly older system but you're thinking of upgrading, then this does give you some level of future proofing. And again, at this price, it's hard to pass up. So anyway, that's my thoughts on this motherboard. Let me know what you think about it in the comment section. Have you had one? Have you owned it? Has it been reliable? Let us know what your thoughts are in the comment section. But for now, I've been Mike. This is Mike's Unboxing Reviews and How To, and hopefully we'll catch you in the very next video. Thanks for watching.